Welcome to Stillwater Fields. Autumn of 1864, where a cornfield whispered louder than rifles. And the night itself seemed to watch. It began with drag marks, deep and deliberate, carved into the wet soil like a signature of panic. The morning mist clung low across the cornfields of Stillwater, Missouri. And when the first light of dawn slipped through the fog, what they saw didn't make sense. The foraging detail's 6 men from Company G, 33rd Missouri, had vanished overnight. No shots, no cries, no bodies. Only the furrows leading back into the rows, and then stopping mid-path, as if the earth had swallowed them whole. Before we begin, pause whatever you're doing. Turn down the lights around you, and imagine standing in that field. The air is cold, damp, breathless. The lantern flame in your hand trembles against the fog. Leave a comment below. Tell us where you're watching from and the exact minute your heart first skips a beat. Because what you're about to hear is not just a war story, it's a trace of something older. Something that watched long before men carried rifles into these rows. The report entered the regimental log at 0500 hours, men unaccounted for. Tracks observed in field. Possible ambush. But the officer on duty, Lieutenant Marrow, added a single line beneath the signature. No sign of struggle. Lanterns found burning. Lanterns, still lit after hours of mist and dew. The wicks dry, the glass unbroken. It shouldn't have been possible. And yet, every survivor swore the same thing. They'd seen the light moving through the rows, steady, low, human in shape. A silhouette pacing the edge of the corn, but never crossing into the open. Some called it a scout, others a deserter. A few whispered an older name, the Watcher. FactLayer, the Army's map of September 1864, shows the Stillwater stretch as unoccupied territory. Neither Confederate nor Union held. Folklore layer oral accounts collected in 1939 by the WPA's Missouri Folklore Project mention a field where men walked in and the rows closed behind them. Both records, military and myth, align on one point: people went missing here, and nothing living was ever found. By sunrise, the investigation began. The soldiers fanned out measuring prints, size 10 boot standard issue. 6 pairs entering, none exiting. The soil compressed evenly, no scuffle, no backward drag. And at intervals of 12 feet, the prints simply ended. Each set terminating with a smooth groove, as if the heel had been lifted by invisible hands. The officer tried to explain it: soft ground, partial flooding. Perhaps the wind had filled the impressions overnight. But wind doesn't move soil upward, and it doesn't erase weight. From a distance, the field looked calm, dew-silvered, endless, beautiful. Up close, it reeked of metal. The corn leaves bore streaks of black ash as though brushed by smoke. Yet no fires were reported that night. Birds wouldn't land. Even the mules refused to step between the rows, braying, circling, as if some vibration kept them at bay. Archival fragments from the 33rd Missouri Infantry's quartermaster log mention requisition delay due to field anomaly. It's the only time that word anomaly appears in a Civil War supply record. Yet folklore fills the silence locals told of a figure that walked the fields after battles, collecting the sound of dying men. Not their souls, they said, just the echoes of their last breath, trapped between the stalks. By mid-morning, a corporal stumbled back from the western edge. His face pale, his uniform soaked in dew. He claimed he'd found a canteen halfway buried, one belonging to Private Ellis, marked with initials carved by knife. Inside, the water was clear, untouched. But when shaken, it gave off a faint metallic rattle like loose shot. They poured it out onto the ground. Not water. Blood clotted black, still warm. The regimental surgeon, Dr. Caleb Rowe, examined the canteen that evening. His notes survive: blood temperature inconsistent with exposure. No explanation feasible. His handwriting faltered as though the pen had been pulled away mid-stroke. Folklore again fills what the Army refused to print. In the nearby town of Lexington, an elderly woman told the interviewer that the field never took men it didn't already know. She meant the land itself remembered. The story went that an old surveyor was buried beneath those acres, a man murdered for drawing maps that revealed where the ground sank deepest. His ghost, they said, marked every man who entered without permission, but the archive says otherwise. War Department dispatches note the area had once been part of a private estate seized for agriculture. Its last owner reported missing in 1856. No records of burial. No trace of the family. Just a single land deed signed by a name later found on the regimental muster roll, Private Hiram Stills. The same H. Stills for whom the fields were named. Coincidence, perhaps, but every missing man belonged to his unit. At 2200 hours that night, a patrol was sent to re-enter the field with flares. 3 men. Their instructions mark every 50 paces, call out every 30 seconds. The log records the first 2 calls, then silence. The flare bursts were seen from the ridge, 1, 2, 3, then nothing. When the light faded, the fog returned thicker than before, and the corn began to move, though there was no wind. Eyewitness statements, though, censored in the official report, survive in family letters. One line recurs across 3 different accounts. It walked upright slow, as if it knew we'd already lost. The figure was described as human height cloaked in the color of the field itself. No face, no sound. Only the rhythmic brushing of leaves. At dawn, the last flare was found half buried, still smoking. The officer wrote only 5 words in the margin. "We will not go back." And they didn't. The company relocated within the week, abandoning Stillwater entirely. The field was never cultivated again. Fact layer closes here. The U.S. Army's 1865 agricultural reclamation map marks the area as unsurveyable terrain. Folklore keeps it alive. Hunters in the 1920s claimed to hear footfalls behind them. Measured, deliberate, always stopping when they turned. During the Dust Bowl, migrant families refused to camp within sight of the old fence line. They said the corn grew without seed, and the soil stayed wet even in drought. A century later, satellite imagery still shows the outline, an oblong patch where crops refuse to grow straight, bending inward like the memory of a spiral. Locals call it the watching field. No one plows there. And when the night fog rolls in, some swear the rows shift again, closing over tracks that were never made. October 1864. Stillwater Township, Missouri. The war had reached its final fever. The fields that once fed entire counties now stood divided by fear and exhaustion. Grain rotted where it fell. Horses stumbled through mud streaked with iron. Every creek ran cloudy, every tree scarred by shot. The corn still stood tall, but the ears were dry hollow, sharp as knives when the wind passed through. To the Union Army, this part of Missouri was nothing more than a corridor, a thin, trembling vein connecting the Mississippi supply lines to the Kansas frontier. But to the people who lived there, Stillwater was the line between what could be explained and what couldn't. The 33rd Missouri Infantry had been assigned to secure rations from the farmlands, a routine forage detail, ordinary, forgettable. They were exhausted men, half-fed, half-awake, carrying damp cartridges and a hunger that made them reckless. Their orders were simple: move through the township, collect grain-secure livestock, return before nightfall. Nothing more, nothing less. The logbooks say they left camp at 1600 hours. But the mist had already begun rolling in from the river. Thick, silent, gray. The kind that turns distances into shapes and shapes into ghosts. Captain Horace Dyer, commanding officer, described the air as heavy metallic and without horizon. That phrase, Still underlined twice in his field report. Survives in the archive. By then, Missouri was bleeding from within. Confederate guerrillas, bushwhackers, haunted the back roads, wearing stolen uniforms, speaking in whispers before ambush. The war had no front line here, only fog suspicion, and graves too shallow to mark. Civilians vanished, houses burned. Even couriers between regiments began to disappear. The land itself felt tired of carrying bodies, tired of holding secrets. But Stillwater had a rhythm of its own. Locals said the corn grew taller after rain than it should, that the soil was too black, too rich, like something fed it from below. Farmhands spoke of hearing movement long after the wind had stopped, the dry rasp of stalks brushing against each other as if breathing. They called it the Whispering Plain. Children were told never to play there after dusk, because the rows remember who walks between them. Maps from the War Department dated late September mark the township as neutral, unoccupied by any major force. A penciled note in the margin reads faintly, "Local reports of disappearances unsubstantiated." But the people here never called them disappearances. They called them collections. The Army didn't believe in stories. They believed in lines, supply lines, command lines, firing lines. But those lines began to blur here. Telegraph wires cut without sound, horses missing without prints, lanterns extinguished mid-watch, and no one heard the glass fall. The soldiers joked about the Stillwater thief, but no one laughed when the first patrol failed to return. The township itself was a patchwork of ruined homesteads burned down to chimneys. Barns collapsed under years of neglect. The few who stayed behind spoke little. They traded food for silence. One widow, recorded in a provost note from October 8th, refused to let soldiers sleep near her property. Her words were simple. "The field takes what it's owed. Don't give it more." The officer wrote beside her name, superstitious, uncooperative. Still, the Army pressed forward. Orders came down from St. Louis: secure agricultural output at any cost. And so they did. They marched under thin moonlight, tramping through soil that clung like tar. The sound of their steps wet, rhythmic, unending, echoing through the rows. At 2100 hours, the fog came again, rolling off the low marshes and across the corn like breath. One private years later told his grandson that the mist moved like a living thing, not drifting, but following. "We kept seeing shapes," he said, "and when we stopped, they stopped too." Meanwhile, the town beyond the fields slept uneasy. Dogs barked toward the river, then fell silent. A farmer wrote in his diary, "Lanterns on the hill again. The blue coats are back." But no sound follows them. That autumn coincided with Price's raid, the great Confederate push through western Missouri. Union detachments were thin, scattered, half-starved. Communication failed daily. But Stillwater wasn't on any campaign map. It wasn't a fort. It wasn't a target. It was a blank space between ink and myth, a place forgotten by strategy, but not by memory. The soldiers who camped nearby swore the cornfields seemed to breathe. The rows shifted in the dark like tides beneath the ground. One man wrote later, "We heard boots in sand, but there was no sand." Another claimed that when he counted the men at dawn, there was one more shadow than bodies. Families on the outskirts whispered another story. They said the land once belonged to a man named Hiram Stills. The same name now faded on every map. Some said he vanished during a dispute over railroad rights. Others said he was buried alive beneath his own crop rows, for drawing boundaries that cut through cursed ground. His spirit, they said, walked the field, each harvest measuring footsteps, counting trespassers. And when the count ended, someone went missing. By mid-October, tension broke into fear. Orders came to abandon the lower farms, but the soldiers hesitated. They swore the fog was alive now. that it followed camp to camp, curling around tents before dawn. Horses refused to move through it. Campfires burned blue instead of orange. And every night the fog returned earlier, thicker, closer. Letters from the 33rd Missouri to the Department of the West mention unexplained atmospheric pressure, a phrase that makes no sense for men fighting a war. But maybe they had no other words. And so folklore filled the gaps. The story that the fog carried the sound of marching, where no men walked. That the ground itself remembered every footstep ever pressed into its skin. The older townsfolk said to cover mirrors at night, so the watcher wouldn't see his reflection and follow it home. Then came the order. A new forage team to re-enter the field, find the missing men, recover supplies, prove the stories false. 6 volunteers stepped forward. They lit their lanterns, adjusted their bayonets, and disappeared into the silver mist. That was October 11th. The last date ever written beneath the words Stillwater Township in the regimental log. No explanation followed. No recovery detail was sent. Just a line drawn through the name, and beneath it, 2 words written in fading pencil. Still watching. And for those who lived near the edge of the field, that was warning enough. They say the corn never fell that winter. It stayed standing tall, dry, golden, unmoving in the snow. And sometimes when the wind passed over the frozen rows, it didn't sound like wind at all. It sounded like breathing. The paper trail begins. In the dust of an army chest found half a century later, its hinges rusted, its lock fused with mud. Inside were fragments, reports stamped with dates and signatures that once meant order, now just silence pressed into paper. October 12, 1864. Stillwater forage. Detail missing in action. The handwriting was clean, deliberate, military. But the ink had bled like something left too close to rain. Those reports told of maps misaligned by half a mile. Compass bearings that drifted west without explanation. A lieutenant's field sketch showing 2 creeks where the survey claimed one. The terrain shifted subtly, but enough to lose men who relied on straight lines. The ground rolls where it shouldn't, one note read, and the trees are older than the charts. The official quartermaster ledgers spoke in numbers: 12 mules lost, 16 barrels requisitioned, 9 rifles unaccounted for. It all sounded neat, measured, until the margins began to fill with corrections. Lantern oil expended prematurely. Flint damp, though no rainfall recorded. Soil moisture inconsistent with prior sampling. Each line a whisper that something somewhere didn't fit physics anymore. The weather logs recorded fog density at 23% impossible for the region in autumn. Wind direction variable. Precipitation none. Visibility none measurable. And yet the crops still stood untouched. The corn rose shoulder high, crisp, silvered at the edges, by dew that never seemed to dry. By October 14th, a new detail had been ordered to survey the land. Their instruments jammed. Compass needles spun, oscillating between north and nothing. A private noted in his journal, "The air feels charged as if metal hangs inside it." Another wrote, "Every step echoes twice, once in the ear, once somewhere below." These were not superstitions. These were men trained to quantify the world, finding no words for what surrounded them. The reports climbed the chain of command from Captain Dyer to Colonel Mercer in St. Louis. Mercer's reply was short, almost irritated. Proceed with standard procedure. Confine explanation to natural cause. Natural cause. The phrase appears 5 times in the following pages, as though repeating it might make it true. When the field engineers arrived, they drove stakes into the earth to mark boundaries. But by dawn, half the stakes were gone. Not broken, not pulled, gone. The earth where they had stood was smooth again, as though swallowed and resealed. They replaced them, marking positions by lantern light. The next morning, gone again. The engineer wrote possible sink activity. But the ground was firm, too firm. The soil, when cut, showed no layers, only one continuous dark seam, slick like oil. They brought in surveyors from the Corps of Engineers men who measured distance for a living. They charted Stillwater across a 3-day window, noting barometric pressure elevation and soil compression. When they returned to camp, their measurements disagreed by hundreds of yards. One swore the corn rows ran east to west. Another drew them north to south. Both maps were dated the same hour. When compared, the lines intersected like crossed threads, a woven field that defied its own geometry. Later that week, the camp physician was asked to analyze the missing men's last known site. He took samples of the soil, wrapped them in linen, sealed them with wax. When those samples reached Jefferson City 3 weeks later, they had changed color. The report describes oxidation inconsistent with mineral content. In simpler words, the dirt had aged, as if time itself moved differently there. Still, the War Department pressed for closure. They needed explanations, not mysteries. Men lost to confusion, visibility reduced, fatigue under duress. Officially, 6 soldiers disappeared. Unofficially, 9 names never reappeared on payroll. When the quartermaster recalculated supplies, he found more rations missing than men. That meant someone or something was eating. Letters from nearby homesteads began to echo the same phrase, the lights in the field. Lanterns moving without carriers drifting low between the rows. Witnesses swore they could hear boots on wet ground, the rhythm slow, deliberate. But no voices, no calls. Just the shuffle and the soft hiss of dew on flame. Captain Dyer's own handwriting survives on a torn dispatch. Recommend closure of sector due to loss of visibility and personnel. The ground has taken more than it can return. He used the word taken, not lost. That single change of verb turned a procedural note into confession. By mid-month, the command withdrew the remaining men. Camp was relocated 3 miles north, closer to the main road. Yet the fog followed. It drifted into tents, clinging to canvas like breath. The men awoke coughing, their boots wet, though no rain had fallen. Powder dampened overnight. Cartridge tins rusted within days. And when the fires were lit, the smoke never rose. It curled downward as if pressed by a ceiling no one could see. The St. Louis Archive holds one photograph, the only surviving image of the Stillwater detachment. 16 men standing in formation, faces blurred by exposure. The negative is overdeveloped black around the edges, grain heavy as sand. But behind them, faint, almost invisible, a ripple moves through the corn. Some archivists say it's just wind caught mid-frame. Others note that no wind was recorded that day. In the months that followed, the war swallowed Missouri whole. Reports of the field faded into the noise of battles, Franklin, Mine Creek, Westport. But even as the front moved on, the paperwork lingered. In December 1864, a requisition officer returned to close the file. His note reads simply, "No further entries. Field abandoned." Yet on the final page of his ledger, in smaller letters, almost an afterthought, "Area unsuitable for habitation. Local superstition advised avoidance." When the war ended, Stillwater vanished from maps. The farms never reopened. The railway survey skipped the coordinates by half a mile. It was as if bureaucracy itself had learned to flinch. The new charts drew clean lines right through it, a straight track where no one dared build. Decades later, in 1907, a group of veterans returning from reunion in St. Louis took a detour to find the old ground. Their account, published in a regional paper, described a patch of land where the air turns thick, where no birds fly and no sound carries. They found no markers, no stones, no signs of war. Only corn growing in perfect rows that led nowhere. And even now, more than a century later, satellite images taken at dawn reveal something the old surveyors could never capture. A patterned circular faint shifting slightly year by year. Soil scientists call it subsidence. Locals still call it by its older name, the watching field. They say the earth there never stopped moving. It just learned to do it quietly. And when the fog rolls in, you can still hear the echo of boots, measured, steady, walking in circles beneath the ground. They said his name was Corporal Nathaniel Pike, 22 years old, a boy from St. Charles County, the youngest son of a blacksmith. His hands were too soft for iron, too restless for farming. He enlisted in the summer of '63, for the pay for the uniform, for a sense of order. But order had no meaning here, not in Stillwater, not after what the fog began to do. He was one of 6 men chosen for the forage detail that entered the cornfield on October 11th. The last day anyone saw them alive. What we know of that night comes not from the logbooks, but from a letter, found months later in a cartridge box near the river bend. The paper was stiff-creased, watermarked with oil and soot. Only fragments remain, sentences that begin and end in the middle of fear. It ain't the Rebs, Captain. It's the quiet. It moves. Marrow says it's mist. But it has shape. We keep hearing them walking, but they stop when we do. The letter breaks off there, the rest eaten away by damp and time. At dusk, Pike had been seen near the edge of the rose, lantern in hand, a thin flame flickering against the windless dark. He was speaking to someone or something inside the corn. The sentry who watched from camp swore he saw a second light answer, deeper in. A slow pulse, as if the field itself breathed back. The fog came thicker after that, a slow tide rising from the soil. The men moved in pairs, rope tied from belt to belt, a trick learned from night scouts to keep from losing each other. Pike's partner was Private Ellis, the same man whose canteen they later found filled with blood that hadn't cooled. They carried little 1 lantern, 2 rifles, a coil of rope, and fear. Ellis wrote in his journal earlier that day, "We go to find the ones who didn't come back. I hope we don't find them standing." That line survived because his journal was never finished. The corn was tall enough to swallow sound. Every step cracked soft and distant, echoing from places that shouldn't echo. When Pike called out, his own voice came back slower, as if dragged through molasses. "Ellis, hold the line," he said. "Don't break the rope." But the rope already trembled like something tugged from the other end. They stopped. The night had no wind, no crickets, no river, just the steady pulse of their own hearts against the fog. "Hear that," Ellis whispered, "like a boot dragging." Pike turned nothing. But the corn shifted 1 row, then another, as though someone walked beside them, matching their pace. Lantern light caught the outline of something metallic on the ground, a buckle union issue glinting for an instant. Pike reached for it. The flame bent toward the soil, drawn low by a breath not his own. "It's warm," he said. "The metal's warm." Then the rope went slack. Ellis pulled once, twice. No answer. The rope lay heavy, no tension, no weight. He called again, "Pike," and the fog answered with the same word. Drawn out. Lower. "Pike." He ran. Lantern swinging, the rope dragging through the stalks behind him like a wounded snake. He didn't stop until he saw the edge of camplight flicker through the haze. He stumbled over the ditch, fell hard, rolled in mud. When they reached him, the rope was still tied to his belt. The other end, cut clean. No fray, no tear, just absence. What happened next lives only in testimony scattered through the regiment's letters and whispers. Men spoke of hearing Pike's voice days later, not shouting, not calling for help, but humming. A low, tuneless hum rising from the field each dawn, fading before noon. They thought it was the wind at first, until someone noticed. It followed the same pattern as the morning roll call. Ellis never spoke again. After the war, he moved west Kansas, then New Mexico, and died in silence, his tongue cut by infection. In his effects, they found one small item wrapped in cloth. A brass button corroded green with the letter P still visible. Beneath it, on a scrap of paper, one sentence in shaky script. "He's not gone. He's just counting slower." That phrase outlived them both. Locals still say it when fog drifts across the low ground. He's counting slower tonight. They mean the Watcher. Or maybe the man who became him. Another story tells of a woman, Anna Pike Nathaniel's sister, who came searching in the spring of 1865. The war had ended, the roads reopened, and rumor carried faster than truth. She reached Stillwater alone, wearing a borrowed coat and carrying her brother's last letter. The townsfolk told her to leave, said the field was cursed, that nothing grew right there anymore. She went anyway. They say she walked into the rose at sunrise, calling his name softly, the way she did when they were children. Witnesses from the ridge swore they saw her lantern light move deep into the field, then stop. The light flickered once, twice, then went out. When they reached the spot hours later, no trace. Only her coat laid neatly across a fence post and the sound of something small ticking beneath the soil. They dug for hours, expecting bone or metal. They found a watch. It still worked. Its hands never moved past the hour it was buried. Some say that watch was returned to her father in St. Charles. Others claim it's still out there ticking beneath the corn, marking time that no one else can hear. And on nights when the fog is thick enough, when the air stands still, you can feel the rhythm through your boots. A slow measured pulse 1 second late every second after. Years later, when locals tried to plow the land again, they unearthed small things, a belt buckle here, a bullet mold there. But the strangest was a row of nails hammered in a perfect circle, even too deliberate to be random. In the center of that circle, the soil was darker, wet even in drought. They covered it again, marking the spot with stones. Farmers avoided it. Hunters left offerings, a coin, a match, a prayer whispered without words. Some believed the Watcher was not one being, but many, the accumulation of every lost man folded into one shadow. Others said it was the land itself, remembering those who forgot to respect it. But among the soldiers who survived, no one used the word ghost. They called it the echo. One veteran interviewed in 1915 described what he felt before leaving camp that final night. It was quiet, he said. Too quiet. Like everything was waiting for someone to speak first. When asked what he heard after that, he paused. A voice, he whispered. Mine. He died 2 years later, his family finding that same word scratched into the underside of his desk. Stillwater. Beneath it, the date 1864. Beneath that one word more. Pike. Sometimes history leaves records in ink. Sometimes it leaves them in sound. A whisper caught between 2 rows of corn. A rope tightening around the waist of a boy who thought he could follow the light. His name barely remembered, but the rhythm of his steps still measured by the ground that took him. And when the fog lifts just for a second, you might swear you see him. Not as a ghost, not as a memory, but as part of the field itself. Lantern in hand, counting slower, listening, waiting. They said his name was Corporal Nathaniel Pike, 22 years old. A boy from St. Charles County, the youngest son of a blacksmith. His hands were too soft for iron, too restless for farming. He enlisted in the summer of '63, for the pay, for the uniform, for a sense of order. But order had no meaning here. Not in Stillwater. Not after what the fog began to do. He was one of 6 men chosen for the forage detail that entered the cornfield on October 11th. The last day anyone saw them alive. What we know of that night comes not from the logbooks, but from a letter, found months later in a cartridge box near the river bend. The paper was stiff-creased, watermarked with oil and soot. Only fragments remain, sentences that begin and end in the middle of fear. It ain't the Rebs, Captain. It's the quiet. It moves. Marrow says it's mist, but it has shape. We keep hearing them walking, but they stop when we do. The letter breaks off there, the rest eaten away by damp and time. At dusk, Pike had been seen near the edge of the rose lantern in hand, a thin flame flickering against the windless dark. He was speaking to someone or something inside the corn. The sentry who watched from camp swore he saw a second light answer, deeper in. A slow pulse, as if the field itself breathed back. The fog came thicker after that, a slow tide rising from the soil. The men moved in pairs, rope tied from belt to belt, a trick learned from night scouts to keep from losing each other. Pike's partner was Private Ellis, the same man whose canteen they later found filled with blood that hadn't cooled. They carried little one lantern, 2 rifles, a coil of rope, and fear. Ellis wrote in his journal earlier that day, "We go to find the ones who didn't come back. I hope we don't find them standing." That line survived because his journal was never finished. The corn was tall enough to swallow sound. Every step cracked soft and distant, echoing from places that shouldn't echo. When Pike called out, his own voice came back slower, as if dragged through molasses. "Ellis, hold the line," he said. "Don't break the rope." But the rope already trembled like something tugged from the other end. They stopped. The night had no wind, no crickets, no river, just the steady pulse of their own hearts against the fog. "Hear that?" Ellis whispered, like a boot dragging. Pike turned nothing, but the corn shifted one row then another, as though someone walked beside them, matching their pace. Lantern light caught the outline of something metallic on the ground. A buckle union issue glinting for an instant. Pike reached for it. The flame bent toward the soil, drawn low by a breath not his own. "It's warm," he said. "The metal's warm." Then the rope went slack. Ellis pulled once, twice. No answer. The rope lay heavy, no tension, no weight. He called again, "Pike," and the fog answered with the same word. Drawn out, lower. "Pike." He ran, lantern swinging, the rope dragging through the stalks behind him like a wounded snake. He didn't stop until he saw the edge of camplight flicker through the haze. He stumbled over the ditch, fell hard, rolled in mud. When they reached him, the rope was still tied to his belt. The other end, cut clean. No fray, no tear, just absence. What happened next lives only in testimony, scattered through the regiment's letters and whispers. Men spoke of hearing Pike's voice days later, not shouting, not calling for help, but humming. A low, tuneless hum rising from the field each dawn, fading before noon. They thought it was the wind at first, until someone noticed. It followed the same pattern as the morning roll call. Ellis never spoke again. After the war, he moved west Kansas, then New Mexico, and died in silence, his tongue cut by infection. In his effects, they found one small item wrapped in cloth, a brass button corroded green with the letter P still visible. Beneath it, on a scrap of paper, one sentence in shaky script, "He's not gone. He's just counting slower." That phrase outlived them both. Locals still say it when fog drifts across the low ground. "He's counting slower tonight." They mean the watcher, or maybe the man who became him. Another story tells of a woman, Anna Pike Nathaniel's sister, who came searching in the spring of 1865. The war had ended, the roads reopened, and rumor carried faster than truth. She reached Stillwater alone, wearing a borrowed coat and carrying her brother's last letter. The townsfolk told her to leave, said the field was cursed, that nothing grew right there anymore. She went anyway. They say she walked into the rose at sunrise, calling his name softly, the way she did when they were children. Witnesses from the ridge swore they saw her lantern light move deep into the field, then stop. The light flickered once, twice, then went out. When they reached the spot hours later, no trace. Only her coat laid neatly across a fence post and the sound of something small ticking beneath the soil. They dug for hours expecting bone or metal. They found a watch. It still worked. Its hands never moved past the hour it was buried. Some say that watch was returned to her father in St. Charles. Others claim it's still out there, ticking beneath the corn marking time that no one else can hear. And on nights when the fog is thick enough, when the air stands still, you can feel the rhythm through your boots. A slow, measured pulse, 1 second late, every second after. Years later, when locals tried to plow the land again, they unearthed small things. A belt buckle here, a bullet mold there. But the strangest was a row of nails hammered in a perfect circle, even too deliberate to be random. In the center of that circle, the soil was darker, wet even in drought. They covered it again, marking the spot with stones. Farmers avoided it. Hunters left offerings, a coin, a match, a prayer whispered without words. Some believed the watcher was not one being, but many the accumulation of every lost man folded into one shadow. Others said it was the land itself, remembering those who forgot to respect it. But among the soldiers who survived, no one used the word ghost. They called it the echo. One veteran interviewed in 1915 described what he felt before leaving camp that final night. It was quiet, he said. Too quiet. Like everything was waiting for someone to speak first. When asked what he heard after that, he paused. A voice, he whispered. Mine. He died 2 years later, his family finding that same word scratched into the underside of his desk. Stillwater. Beneath it, the date 1864. Beneath that, one word more. Pike. Sometimes history leaves records in ink. Sometimes it leaves them in sound. A whisper caught between 2 rows of corn. A rope tightening around the waist of a boy who thought he could follow the light. His name barely remembered, but the rhythm of his steps still measured by the ground that took him. And when the fog lifts just for a second, you might swear you see him. Not as a ghost, not as a memory, but as part of the field itself. Lantern in hand, counting slower, listening, waiting. By the spring of 1865, the war was ending, but the record of Stillwater refused to close. The Union Army had buried its dead, sealed its archives, and drawn new borders on paper. Yet one folder remained open. Unresolved Anomaly Agricultural Survey pending. A simple bureaucratic note, tied to a place that no longer existed on maps. When the Corps of Engineers returned that April, they came not as soldiers, but as scientists. Their task: reclaim the land, verify the loss, and redraw the boundaries. The officer in charge was Captain Ezra Holt, a man known for precision. His journals described rivers by scent, winds by weight. He trusted instruments, not superstition. And yet by the second day he wrote, "Something is wrong with the way distance behaves here. Theodolites jammed. Chains refused to align. Their compasses spun a slow, steady turn, as if drawn toward a pulse below ground. Magnetic interference, he reasoned, likely from ore deposits. But there were no mines in Stillwater. The soil was loam, nothing more. At night, the team camped near the ridge. Holt recorded the sounds in his log movement between rows, rhythmic, deliberate, like marching heard underwater. He counted 13 distinct footfalls. There were only 10 men in his unit. They searched, found nothing. The corn, they said, swayed against the wind's direction. The next morning, their first map was missing. Holt blamed the fog. He drew another. But when the sketches were compared side by side, the coordinates shifted. The creeks had moved. The fence line now ran in a curve where yesterday it had been straight. It's as if the field remembers differently each day, he wrote. His handwriting trailed off into a single line, then stopped. Back in St. Louis, the Department of Agriculture filed an official statement. Topographical distortion due to hydrological saturation. Long words for a short truth they didn't know. Decades passed. The war became memory. But the field didn't forget. Farmers who tried to reclaim it after Reconstruction found their plows jamming mid-row. Iron bent. Oxen refused to move. In 1882, one farmer documented that the soil clung to the blade like flesh. He left Missouri within the year. Then, the rail survey of 1891. A crew of 10 men marking a route west toward Kansas. Their foreman, Charles Dutton, filed one report before the line veered north. His words, "We followed the compass west, but the track ran back to itself. We walked 4 miles forward and ended behind our own camp. The next page is blank, only a fingerprint smudged in graphite." By 1904, the field had turned into rumor. A place where instruments fail and sound falls inward. But that year, a professor from Washington University named Dr. Levi Garrison arrived to prove the legend false. He specialized in geology, believed in erosion, not ghosts. He brought a camera, a barometer, and a pocket watch that ticked like authority. His notes survive careful, scientific, methodical. Entering Stillwater Tract, 11:47 a.m. Temperature unseasonably low. Air damp, no insects audible. Compass deviation recorded 11 degrees west. Watch stopped 11:49. His assistant, a student named Russell, wrote in the margin, "The field swallows time." They laughed then, but by the next morning the laughter was gone. Their tent had sunk 3 inches overnight. No collapse, no hole, just descent. "Ground compression inexplicable," Garrison wrote. "Feels as though the soil exhales beneath us." When they left, the negatives from their camera were black overexposed without light. He blamed the lens. But his final note tells a different story. The corn glows at night. He never published again. The government returned once more, 1912 surveyors with early radio equipment to test signal strength. The operator's log shows 20 seconds of transmission, then distortion. A sound like boots in gravel, multiplied, layered, pulsing in rhythm. When replayed at half speed, the noise forms patterns. 9 steps, pause, then one long drag. The same rhythm reported in 1864. In 1920, a new mapmaker, Thomas Greer, drew the area again for county records. His wife later told journalists he began talking in his sleep, reciting numbers, coordinates, troop counts. He'd whisper, 33 men. "No return," she said. He died 2 months later of what the papers called fever. His map remained unpublished. When the county archivist finally opened the drawer decades later, she found the paper warped into a spiral, ink running inward toward the center, as if pulled by gravity. By the 1930s, the WPA folklore teams arrived collecting stories of Missouri's haunted and forgotten lands. Most were tales of rivers, mills, forgotten churches. But Stillwater stood apart. They interviewed an old man named Randall, who claimed his father had fought there. They said they were fighting the war, Randall told them. But the land was fighting them back. When asked what he meant, he smiled. The corn kept count. Then came the Dust Bowl, the decade when wind erased half the Midwest. Fields turned to wasteland, but not Stillwater. While the neighboring farms dried and cracked, its soil stayed wet, dark, stubborn. Pilots flying overhead said the ground shimmered after dusk like heat rising in reverse. One crop duster recorded his altimeter dropping without descent. His radio went dead. When he returned, he said it looked like the earth was breathing. Scientists called it groundwater anomaly. Locals called it memory. In 1952, a hydrologist named Aaron Page revisited the site with new instruments. His goal to test soil conductivity. The results were never published, but his assistant later admitted what they saw. The readings rose and fell in rhythm like a heartbeat. The soil pulse measured every 9 seconds, the same interval as a marching pace. By then, the legend had fused with history, the watcher, the lost soldiers, the fog that walked. Yet the data refused to die. The last government notation, 1961, lists the coordinates as non-agricultural zone unstable magnetic field. And beneath a handwritten note in red pencil, advise avoidance. Reports of auditory illusion, possible interference. Auditory illusion. A careful phrase for what witnesses described as voices calling from underground. It's like someone reading a list, one man said. Names, maybe. But the order keeps changing. In 1978, an amateur historian named Miles Porter filmed a short documentary on the Civil War in Missouri. He included Stillwater by chance, a background stop. His camera caught 30 seconds of footage before jamming. The frame shows a field of corn under low mist, nothing unusual. But when slowed down, the image reveals a ripple moving against the wind. Within it, faint outlines like men walking in step. The film ends abruptly melting in the projector. Porter never returned. By the 1990s, technology reached what the 19th century could only fear. A satellite pass recorded electromagnetic fluctuation over the coordinates, faint circular repeating. When converted into audio frequency, it produced a rhythm of 9 beats. Pause, 1 drag. The same cadence again. Geologists today call it coincidence. Mathematicians call it pattern recognition. But for those who live near Stillwater, it's not theory. It's inheritance. The sound of something that refuses to let go of its own record. Some nights, truckers on the county road swear their engines die at mile marker 41. The headlights dim, the radio hums, and the static becomes a voice. Not words, just the rhythm of counting. Slow, patient, endless. When the power returns, their clocks read the same minute as if time itself had stepped aside. And so the legend of the Watcher doesn't end in the past. It keeps finding new recorders, surveyors, scientists, cameras, satellites, each trying to explain what should not exist. And each in turn adds another layer to the archive. The military called it interference. The scientists called it resonance. The locals just call it the field remembering itself. And somewhere beneath that memory, if you listen close enough, you can still hear the drag of boots through soil. Not forward, not backward, just circling, always circling, counting slower. By the time the 20th century caught up with Stillwater, it was already too late to name what lived there. The records, what remained of them, had become ritual. Each new investigator copied the old mistakes, drew the same line, circled the same coordinates, and stopped at the same silence. They didn't know they were repeating history. They didn't know they were completing it. When the last formal report came through, stamped March 3, 1964, a century to the month since the original disappearance, the heading read, Agricultural Restoration, Phase 2. But the attached notes told another story. Team reports auditory feedback consistent with previous anomaly. Requests immediate evacuation. The signature at the bottom was illegible. The ink smeared, as though signed mid-tremor. From there, the file ends abruptly mid-sentence. The next page is blank, except for 3 words in faint pencil. Still watching us. For decades after the field lay untouched. No more surveys, no experiments. The government simply rerouted the road-planted trees at the perimeter and called it preservation. But every so often, someone went missing anyway. A hunter, a surveyor. Once a photographer mapping the cloud lines, always the same note in the report: equipment failure. Visibility reduced. No recovery possible. By then the locals had stopped explaining. They just said Stillwater doesn't forget. The soil remained too fertile for death, too dark for daylight. When you stepped there, they said you could feel a hum under your boots, faint like a heartbeat through wood. It wasn't the earth moving. It was memory shifting. And in those moments, you understood something the army never did. The land wasn't haunted by the dead. It was haunted by the living who tried to measure it. There's a story told by a state surveyor who broke protocol one night and walked the rows alone. He carried a flashlight, a recorder, and an old photograph of the 33rd Missouri Infantry. His voice, recovered later from the tape, begins calm, then begins to slow. I'm walking east, following the ridge. Pause. The light just went out. Pause again. There's someone ahead of me. Static follows a long, breathing static, interrupted by something like footsteps. At the end of the tape, his own voice again. Soft. Detached. It's not watching. It's remembering. No trace of him was found. But the tape kept running for 12 more minutes. A sound looped inside 9 steps. One drag. Then silence. The archivists played it hundreds of times, thinking it was error. But each time the pattern matched the old records, the sound of boots moving through wet soil counted from 1864 to the modern day. 9 steps. One drag. Over and over, as if the land itself was still marching. It wasn't superstition anymore. It was repetition, the oldest kind of proof. And maybe that's the truth Stillwater was holding all along. That some places don't remember us kindly. They remember the pattern, the weight, the rhythm of trespass. Captain Dyer's last surviving journal, preserved in the Library of Congress under Unclassified Field Records, Missouri, 1864, ends with a single sentence written on the back cover. The fog knows our names. He'd written it backwards, mirror style, as though meant for something else to read. Historians call that line poetic stress exhaustion, the breakdown of reason. But those who've stood near Stillwater at dawn say otherwise. They say the mist moves like it's reading lips, and the numbers kept returning. 33 men in the 33rd Regiment. 9 vanished without trace. Every later investigation in 1907, in 1952, in 1994, conducted by 9-man teams. Not 10, not 8, 9, always the same. None of them planned it. None of them realized. Until after. The repetition is what unnerves the scientists most. Not the mystery, but the symmetry. The way coordinates fold into themselves, the way compass bearings return to their start, the way sound loops where it shouldn't. Closed system, one physicist called it. A place that remembers its own direction, a perfect circle of memory. Once you step inside, you don't vanish. You repeat. And so the watcher may never have been a ghost, but a function, a reflex of the Earth's own recording. Every bootstep, every heartbeat, every whisper of fear, imprinted and replayed forever. If you listen closely even now, the corn still rustles in time. 9 steps, one drag. 9 steps, one drag. The rows bending and unbending as if following the rhythm. The sound of breath behind the leaves. The metallic chime of a canteen striking against bone. There's testimony from a highway worker in 1971 who reported hearing voices through the asphalt paver. He said it sounded like a roll call, faint, muffled, precise. When they paused the machine, the sound stopped. When they started again, it resumed, matching the motion of the drum. It was like the ground was speaking through the iron, he said. He quit the next day. His supervisor marked the report as auditory fatigue. But when the asphalt cooled, small circles appeared in the pattern of the grain. Perfect impressions of marching boots. And so the watcher is not gone, only quieter. It doesn't appear in vision anymore, but in repetition. In the way machines fail near the coordinates. In the way clocks stutter when the fog comes low. In the way sound folds back on itself, not echo, but memory re-speaking. It is not a ghost story. It is a feedback loop. The land recording and re-recording until all who pass through become part of its frequency. In the last government report ever filed on Stillwater, 1979, a single engineer wrote in the margin, "If resonance is memory, this ground is alive." He was never promoted after that, but his phrase stayed copied into folklore, into essays, into whispers. Alive. The truth is, the field was never meant to be measured. It was meant to be remembered. Every attempt to define it, to own it, to farm it, only deepened the groove. Like a phonograph needle playing the same track over and over until the record itself wears smooth. Maybe that's why the fog still comes. Not to haunt, but to play the song again. To remind us that not all silence is empty. Some of it listens back. And at dawn, when the light finally breaks through for a heartbeat, the field looks still. The corn stands quiet. The soil glistens. But if you look long enough, you'll see at the smallest motion, like the ground exhaling. You'll think it's wind. You'll tell yourself it's nothing. But you'll know. You'll know that somewhere beneath that earth, the story never ended. It just began to repeat. 9 steps, 1 drag, 100 years apart. The same sound, the same silence, the same count. Still watching, still listening, still there. Time passed, and history forgot what it could not explain. The war ended. The flags folded, the medals dulled, the graves filled, but Stillwater stayed. It did not ask to be remembered. It simply refused to be erased. By the late century, the township no longer appeared on any map. Roads curved around its edges as though the cartographers had learned to draw with hesitation. Surveyors called it unstable ground. Locals called it something older, the breathing plain. In the spring, wildflowers grew there, blue and white, the colors of both sides of a war that had long since ended. No one planted them. They just came. The wind never lingered there. It passed quick, cautious, as though not to disturb what lay beneath. Children born nearby were told not to run too close to the old fence line. You'll wake the field, their mothers warned, and it will remember you. Teenagers dared each other to walk through the fog at dusk. None ever reached the other side. They came back shaken. Their watches stopped, their shoes wet with dew, though the ground was dry. They never spoke much afterward, just looked toward the corn when it swayed against no wind. In the years that followed, men came with machines, tractors, plows, steel teeth meant to claim the land. But one by one, the engines failed. Not broken, silenced. Oil thickened. Axles froze. As if the field had learned where to touch and how to make metal remember pain. One mechanic swore he heard a heartbeat inside the engine block. 9 beats, he said, and then it stopped. No one built there again. Stillwater became a void on the map, a gap in the modern grid. A place where satellites lose signal, and compasses slow like they're catching their breath. The coordinates are there, but the machines look away. And yet, every decade or so, someone still goes. Not soldiers now, but seekers, historians, believers, the kind of people who want proof that memory has weight. They bring their cameras, their notebooks, their certainty. But what they bring back is always the same. A hum on the tape, a fog on the lens, a pattern in the soil that doesn't match geometry or chance. One researcher in 2003 described it perfectly. It feels like standing in the breath between 2 heartbeats. That phrase, fragile exact, is perhaps the truest record we'll ever have. Because the field does not speak in words, it speaks in rhythm. It keeps time the way the dead keep time, slow, precise, unhurried. The way a memory returns when you think you've forgotten. There are those who say the watcher was never a figure at all, that it was the collective weight of all those who once looked away, a consciousness built from silence. That what haunted the soldiers wasn't punishment, but preservation. The land storing the sound of their fear, their confusion, their last breath, holding it so it wouldn't vanish. The field became a memory vault built not by design, but by grief. Others tell a different story. They say Corporal Pike never died, that he became part of the soil itself, a pulse underfoot, a breath in the fog, that each time the mist rises, he counts again. 9 steps, 1 drag, searching for the rope that once connected him to the living. His name isn't carved in stone anywhere, but the ground whispers it back every autumn when the corn turns gold. If you stand at the edge of Stillwater today just before dawn, the world goes quiet. The air flattens heavy with dew. You can see your breath, and sometimes you can see it move without you. People who have been there describe the same thing, a sense that something enormous, ancient, and aware is listening. Not with malice, just with memory. And when the first light breaks the horizon, the fog pulls back slow like a curtain unwilling to end the show. The field glows in gray and silver. The rows seem endless. You can almost imagine them moving, like the ripple of a uniformed line of formation still marching long after the orders stopped. Some say that's the true curse of Stillwater, not that it kills, but that it keeps, that it remembers too well. Every sound, every step, every mistake. That it never lets war end. It simply replays it softer each time, until even the ghosts forget what side they fought for. Maybe that's why the wind avoids it. Why birds veer away mid-flight. Why rain clouds part above, as if the sky itself hesitates. Some silences are not emptiness, they are full overflowing, waiting to be heard. And maybe that's what we've misunderstood all along. That ghosts don't haunt out of anger, but out of duty. They keep watch because someone must remember. The field remembers. Even now, when satellites cross above Missouri, the coordinates flicker for a fraction of a second. A static pulse, a heartbeat. Analysts blame interference, but the signal repeats every cycle, every orbit, at the exact same interval. 9 pulses, 1 pause. The watcher's still counting. And so the story ends where it began, in silence, in fog, in rhythm. The rows stand. The soil breathes. The sound continues. Somewhere beneath the corn boots still drag through the dark. Not lost, not gone, just part of the record. And as the narrator's voice fades, the camera lingers on the field, white still endless. Wind moves through it at last. The stalks bend and whisper. You can almost make out words. Or maybe it's just the sound of the past remembering itself. Still watching, still listening, still there.